Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
Imagine growing up in a place where home is a room with a view of the highway and your neighbors are always just passing through. This was the reality for our guest today, Foram Mehta, who spent her childhood in motels owned by her parents. For most people, motels are just brief pit stops during long journeys. But for Foram, they were the backdrop of her formative years, a place where transient guests defined her daily life.
In this episode, we dive into Foram's unique childhood, where she shares the extraordinary and often challenging experiences of living behind the front desk, the lessons learned from a life on the move, and how her upbringing in this unconventional setting shaped her view of the world. So let's hear what it really was like growing up in a motel. All right, hey Foram, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Foram. I'm an Indian American freelance journalist and editor. I live in DC. I have almost a 2-year-old toddler.
And obviously we're talking to you because there's something special about you. You grew up in a particularly interesting situation, or you had a particularly interesting upbringing. When you were younger, you lived in a motel. Your parents owned a motel.
I did.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I grew up living in various motels, actually. My parents are Gujarati American immigrants. There's a large population of Gujarati Americans who chose the career of being motel owners / managers. It's actually I always tell my husband that any mom and pop motel that you drive past in any city in America, I'm always like, yeah, that's probably owned by a Gujarati family. And we love to go back and forth on that. And I always tell him that I would put $1,000 down to bet that that motel was owned by a Gujarati family. So it's a very typical occupation for Gujarati Americans. And I moved here when I was 4. From India, and my parents, immediately, that's the occupation that they chose. We lived all across America, mostly in towns that you would be surprised to find a brown family in. And I didn't really think about that when I was a kid until the people in those towns were like, how did you land here? Literally, they would talk to me as if I was alien, and they were like, how did you land here? Because it was towns like Georgetown, Kentucky, and Tonkawa, Oklahoma, Marlin, Texas. These are literally, you've never heard of these towns. There are these towns in these states where you have people who have been there for generations. People don't move to these towns. And yeah, that's how I grew up from the time that I moved here from America until I was 18 and went to college. And my parents literally just retired. So home base was always going back to a motel in East Texas where they were living.
Besides people kind of seeing you as an alien and landing in a spaceship or whatever, what are some of the strangest experiences that you've kind of experienced?
Just never having full access to my parents at any given time of the day. It was just such a weird way to grow up in comparison to my friends who had parents who just had regular day jobs, where they went to this day job and they came home and then they were home. The phone would ring nonstop, or customers would come in. And we lived almost in one place, the apartment was attached to the office. So behind the counter, there was a door that went into our apartment. This last place that my parents lived in for the longest period of time, we lived above the lobby. So, but it was still our house. And we had a video system and audio system, so you could hear customers come in. And it was just so destructive, right? So all day, you could be watching TV, hanging out with your parents after dinner. And it was oh, there's a customer here. They would have to run downstairs and go tend to the customer. The phone would ring. And my parents would be busy. So I'd have to pick up the phone. And it wasn't just me saying hello. It was me saying the name of the hotel and asking them how can I help you? And that was the entire life. Even though it was my norm, I recognized even growing up, how weird it was. And even now I'm what a weird way to grow up. That was like generally the strangest experience. It was just like that entire experience was strange.
How much did you actually interact with guests yourself?
A lot. My parents, because it was like a family business. My parents, especially early on when they were like coming up, they would clean the rooms, they would run the desk, my dad would do maintenance. And so we did everything. And so like they would have to go do something and they would put us at the front desk. I was like, I didn't interact with customers too much until I was like probably 14. But I mean, I answered their phone from a young age because a lot of what would happen, this is like back in the day when like cell phones weren't super ubiquitous. And so people would call so they could talk to a guest. And so like a lot of the reasons why people would call was to be transferred to a room. And that was really obnoxious all day long. And there would be some people who would, if they don't pick up, they call back in 5 minutes. We were a call center, basically. Like we were patching calls through. And so I interacted a lot with guests that way. Sometimes people would get really annoyed because someone wasn't picking up or like the phone was off the hook. And we were like, well, what do you want us to do about it? Like, and then when I was like 14 and older, my parents would like go to a function or something and I would work the desk and I would have to rent rooms or interface with people coming through and asking for how much a motel room costs for the night and things like that. Like from a young age, I was interacting with customers.
Was it ever lonely for you? Or did you just kind of spend the time with the guests?
No, I did not spend it with guests. It was lonely. It was like, but I don't know if I considered it lonely as much as like it was obtrusive. It was lonely in the sense that like it wasn't an experience that like my friends had, and we were one of the only like motel owners in the towns because they were these really really small towns. So I didn't have like a lot of people, if any people, to relate to, and so it was just like a weird isolating experience that like no one else could really relate to. I mean, I had cousins, like my parent, my mom's entire extended family is in America, and they all run motels, and so like cousins got it, but it wasn't something we like talked about. It was just like talking about things really wasn't a family tradition. As somebody who's a child of immigrants, like that's not something we do anyway, in terms of like talking about things that are like bothering you. But it was really just like obtrusive. I just remember that growing up was just like, God, it never felt like we were without the motel. The motel was the center of our universe, and it was the shackle and chains that bound particularly my parents, but like us as a family, because they couldn't just pick up and like we couldn't take family vacations because the motel had to be watched out. And like when it's your entire livelihood, you're not going to like leave it to just anybody to run. Your home is also connected to it, so that's a weird part of it. I would say obtrusive more than lonely.
Yeah, it really was like a part of your everyday life. You come home from school and then your motel stuff, homework too, but motel stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also growing up in like East Texas. What was East Texas like?
I always tell people this story to highlight. It's not that I want people to feel like this is the entire color of East Texas, but it was a dominant color of the culture there. One of the first experiences I had was sitting in art class when I was a freshman. And I knew now, like, I've moved to this town as a teenager in high school. It's like already awkward and uncomfortable enough as like somebody who, if you just lived in the same place your whole life, it's just an awkward experience. But now I'm new. And so I was already feeling really alone and nervous about living in this place. And sitting in art class, one of the first like weeks or something, this white Christian girl found out that that I wasn't Christian. And she said, with like full conviction, oh my God, you don't believe in Jesus? You're going to go to hell.
I don't know how I'd react to that.
She wasn't laughing and I wasn't laughing at the time.
That's crazy.
But that was like, oh, wow. Okay. So that's what, it is the Bible Belt. And the defense of Lufkin, Texas, which is where there were other people sitting at that table, also white, also brown, like white and brown, who just looked at her and were like, you're the reason why people think that this is great. Who were like equally shocked and disgusted that she said. But it was like a very Christian, very conservative town that also had a very high population of Blacks and Hispanics. So I had a lot of people, like it was like very diverse in that way. And I made a lot of good friends with like other people who looked like me. But who ruled the town? It was like kids with the money, with the, who like were
Yeah.
Christian. Like these are like, that was just very stereotypical of a small Texas town.
So you also mentioned Oklahoma and Kentucky. How do those compare to Texas?
Kentucky, I have just like no real notable memories of because only went to school when I was in preschool there, and I wish I had some memories of it because like I mean we just moved from India and then I went to preschool there. Actually, I had my first crush in Kentucky. I do remember that. That is like the one thing that I do remember. It was just like this beautiful blonde blue-eyed boy that I just had a crush on. And that's why I always find that so funny because I'm like, oh my gosh, my parents were probably like, oh my God, what did we do? I remember coming home one day and being like, oh my gosh, Jeremiah tied my shoes for me today. I remember his name. He was very cute. I don't have any other memories of Kentucky other than that. Oklahoma was like, also, I don't have any memories of it that stand out in the sense that culturally, like it stood out to me, like I was really young and we lived in a town, Tonkawa, and this motel that my parents ran was off the highway. So that's what I remember. It was like, there was nothing around us. Literally, it was like motel, a field, and like a highway overpass. And that's what I remember about that place.
It sounds like
and
Oklahoma.
then we lived in Tulsa for 2 years after that, which was like
nice.
the first city that I had ever lived in. And I really loved it there. There was a lot of Indian Americans and particularly Gujaratis there. So my parents built community there. I built community there. That was really nice. But Texas is really what I remember, I like impactful memories of Texas in the way that I don't have of Oklahoma and Kentucky.
In terms of like what a typical day was, can you just walk that through? You would come back home from school, or even like, let's just start from the beginning. You wake up. What do you do?
I wake up and depends. Like when I was younger, when we lived in this town, Marlin, Texas, and my parents were really doing like everything by themselves. On the weekends, like my sister and I were pulled in to help with motel chores, and my job. That age, I was 8 years old. My job was to do furniture polish on all the pieces of, high quality furniture that were in the motel rooms. And I remember like taking the pledge furniture polish with a cloth, and they would give us a list of rooms and we would go around the property and I would do that. And then my sister would vacuum. And then at some point I was starting to take out the trash. And I remember it was so gross. Like I hated taking out trash. Taking out trash is gross anyway, but taking out other people's trash. And it was like those like flimsy, trash liners. People would just put all sorts of stuff in there, like beer cans of liquid. And then like, yeah, I'm sure I saw things that at the time I didn't realize what they were. And I'm like, like I don't have memories of like finding weird, gross things and then wondering what they were. I just remember it being like a disgusting thing to have to do. But we just did it. That was just what we had to do. And then we would go in after a while and like my mom would come in, make lunch, run the motel in other ways that she needed to. Then she would clean up. We would I don't even know what we did on the weekends. My parents were just always busy. They were. And then when my sister was able to drive, we started going to Waco, Texas, which was the nearest city to us. And I always tell people it had a Taco Bell. So that was the thing. It had Taco Bell, had a mall, and had a movie theater. So we would go to Waco sometimes on the weekend. And then the rest of the day still, my mom's working and cooking and cleaning. She's doing all the house stuff. And we see them in between. And then we go to sleep. And that was our day. And then as I got older, again, as I started driving, I started having some independence, but it's just, we spent a lot of time just not seeing our parents because they were busy. And so it was kind of I guess any other typical kids weekend or day. When we would come home from school, it was the same thing. My parents were still working. So we just didn't really see them in solid blocks of time.
I mean, that's got to be kind of rough too, because Like looking back on it, do you feel like maybe you didn't get enough personal time with them? Or do you feel like that just, okay, yeah.
I definitely do. And I say that particularly now because my parents are retired and they have come to visit. And, they have a grandson now and like, they're just like relaxed. And when they come here, even when they were coming to visit me in like the various places that I lived in post college, when I got married, I was living in San Francisco. And then we moved to DC in 2021. When they would come to visit, like they were still, like their mind was still half hotel. Like they would have to call, check in, and then like inevitably the person running the motel had messed something up. So then they would have to fix the mess from here. And it was just like, I always like, I'm an empath and I always felt like I was like absorbing that anxiety, that they had because it was just such a burden it provided everything for us, but it was a huge burden for my parents and for for the family. And when they retired and they like came to visit us or we like went to go see them, it was like so nice to just see my parents like relaxed and, having a cup of tea, watching TV, just like moving through their day slowly without this like constant thing that they have to do next. And that it's just really nice to have them be present in that way that they've just never been able to be present, particularly now that they have a grandson that they really want to spend that time with.
Do you have any memories that stick out in your mind in terms of guests or just something that may have happened at the motel?
Yeah, a couple of times. Like I always remember this one time right after 9/11 that somebody got really upset with, whatever decision had been made, whatever request they had made was denied or, whatever discontent they had regarding the motel room or whatever. And they got really upset with my dad and they called him Osama. And, it's just like, it's like a very scary thing to like witness. I was very young and thank God, like, I mean, there's scary stories of like people, getting in confrontations. Like you can Google it, there's like people who have died, people who have like been seriously beat up. Like there's a lot of like really scary things that have happened. And my dad also was like not one to like immediately back down from things. And so sometimes like I always felt like escalate with a customer or like, my English is like my parents' second language. And so that was something that was difficult because like with my mom, like I remember that would happen a lot. Things would get lost in translation. And now like people's, moods are like totally shot because everyone's like misunderstanding each other, more and more frustrated. And like, I remember many times like trying to like mediate a situation because I was trying to like explain to the customer what the deal was. I was trying to explain to my mom, so I remember, that one particular instance, like being young and seeing that. But there were other times, they don't stick out to me individually, but there were many times when I was like, oh my gosh, like I was just like on the edge of my seat, just like nervous that like something was going to escalate past the point of somebody getting hurt. And thank God, like that's not something that my parents dealt with, but there were times when it was close, I felt like.
Did you ever find out from your parents, what made them run a motel?
Yeah, no, I've never like asked them explicitly. I would imagine like the answer if I asked them would be like, well, that's just what everybody was doing. Like I said, like my mom is one of 7. Almost all of her siblings that are older than her had moved to the States before we did. They were all in motel business. They've all been very successful. At that time, my dad's brother, at least one of his brothers was also in the motel business. It's just kind of like what everybody did. And it was a unique opportunity to live this American dream by, like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and working hard and like having something of your own, working your way up to something. Like my parents didn't own motels the whole time. Like they were managers early on. Like they were like, my dad would do night shift at the front desk, whereas my mom would do laundry. Then like over time they were managing motels and they bought a motel. And it is a very, it was like this linear path to success that like you could achieve. It's pretty phenomenal. So when you think about it, that like this population of people who like have no experience doing this have all just kind of learned how to do it and are doing it really, really well. Like they figured it out. And so I thought they were just like, yeah, I mean, that's what we were going to do because that's what was going to help us achieve this American dream. And for them, it really did.
Foram, I know you had mentioned this a little bit, but what were some of the biggest challenges your family faced in running the motel, and how did you kind of overcome them together as a family?
Biggest challenges, language barriers, not like really having, a foundation in like hospitality, kind of running. I would say often there were times when like, my parents, for example, like kind of approached customer interactions in different ways. And that could be challenging because like my dad was a little bit more like he, I think, could kind of get people to like de-escalate and like talk them down. Whereas like with my mom, I found that often like things would kind of escalate. And I think a lot of it had to do with the language barrier. And it wasn't, always her fault. It was like, I'll take that back. Like it was rarely like something that she did, right? Like it was like people would get frustrated because they couldn't understand her, or like, like people had like high expectations of like the amenities that they wanted. My parents were like, listen, this is a mom and pop. What do you want the 5-star treatment. You go to some other place. Like you get a clean room and you get all the amenities, like stuff like the Wi-Fi, tech things. It's like 2 people running the entire place. Not like my dad didn't have like a background in like plumbing, for example, but he had to figure stuff out when like pipes would burst or whatever. It's like a really challenging occupation to like take on when you're the owner, you're the manager, you're the head of maintenance, you're the head of laundry, you're the like everything. So they had to learn all that. And how do they overcome it? They worked really hard, and like they there was a lot of really, really tough moments. Like for example, a handful of years ago when Texas like froze over, and you saw all those like videos of Ted Cruz like in Mexico while Texas literally didn't have hot water. My parents' motel was like one of the few places in town that had like hot water, or they had electricity but no hot water, something like that. I remember being like, God, like my parents didn't sign up to run this like. I mean, it felt like a refugee camp at the time because it was like people like were like, oh, I had nothing, like no electricity, no hot water, and they were coming to the motel, and everybody was in such an awful situation. These people are like ousted of their homes, can't be in their home. Now they're paying fees to like stay in a motel room, and my parents didn't have all the amenities either. And like I remember in the middle of the night, like their pipes burst because and they then had to like absorb all of the angst and frustration that people had because people felt like, well, look, I'm paying you. And my parents were like, we're not God. Like we can't like create electricity and hot water from a place that doesn't exist. And so it was really interesting and like challenging because my parents were always at the center of like almost like all natural disasters that were in the area. When Hurricane Rita and Hurricane Katrina hit back in like 2006 and 2007. I was still in high school. We were about 2 hours from Houston, which is where Rita hit, and Katrina was New Orleans. And so when Katrina hit New Orleans, everybody went to Houston to find refuge. Rita hit not too long after that. Everybody moved further up north. And so my parents were absorbing like all these people who were, in really awful positions. And at the same time, my parents are running a motel. They're not running like base camps for people to like get back up on their feet. So it was really hard to be in positions like that. And that would create a lot of like frustration for like, a lot of everybody, because is the case with a lot of situations. It was the government's fault and failure, but it was the people suffering. And my parents were right in the center of that. So I would say like that was like a main challenge that my parents experienced. And I was there a lot of that time, and it was really, really stressful. But we just had to like plow through it. There was nothing else to do.
You wrote about your experiences growing up in motels. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, in 2019, I was I was like in the middle of kickstarting my freelance career again, and I what made me reflect at that particular point in time, but I was reflecting on like the lessons that I had learned by living in a motel my whole life, like unique lessons to living in a motel. And I pitched the story to HuffPost And I was just really, really fortunate because the editor who responded to me is also Indian American. And she wanted to pick up that story for AAPI month, which is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which is every May. And she was just a really fantastic editor. And if you guys are familiar with Brown Girl Therapy, which is an online community for children of immigrants, the founder of Brown Girl Therapy is Sahaj Kohli. She's actually the editor that I worked with. At the time, she was working full-time in journalism. And, that she just helped me tell a really, really, really great story about my upbringing. And that was the first time in my writing career that I realized that the power of storytelling can have a huge impact on the community you're highlighting. Because that story kind of went viral, not by I don't have hard figures, but I shared it on Facebook, and it was shared and reshared and reshared, and I had people reaching out to me that I had never talked to before, and it was because there was all of these thousands of children of all these motel kids, as I call them, who were oh my God, this is the first time anyone's written about what it was like to grow up like this. And it was such a cool experience for me, because I was wow, this is so cool to write about something that it was my experience, but it's a shared experience. That was the first time that I was you know what, I want to share more about the communities that I'm in, because not everybody has the opportunity to tell a story about their community. And that was something that I really learned after that, writing that story. So I've written a lot about the various the myriad of experiences of growing up as an Indian American, and I've always experienced that since then. Just people are always wow, thank you for telling this story, because no one's ever talked about that before. And yet so it's so relatable to so many people.
I'm glad you did, because that's how we found you. People have a lot of misconceptions about motels and, people living in motels. So what would you say about them? Well, one, what are the misconceptions that you encounter the most? And what would you say about them?
I was just wondering, what misconceptions do people have? Because I found that most people didn't even know that this was a body of people, that lived in motels. But I would say the biggest misconception is that it's a very cool, glamorous life. That was the number one thing that people thought it was. And when I say people, I mean kids, my fellow peers in school, who were oh my God, at the time, The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody was popular on Disney, and was telling of my age. But they were oh my God, do you order room service every night? Do you they would ask me crazy questions, and I was no, we don't offer room service. But also, no, that's not what my life is like. So people thought it was a really cool, I was camped out in a suite and calling the, kitchen to send me up food. That's not what motel life was like, by far. So number one misconception. And then the other one was that people often would be do you sleep in different rooms for fun? And I was no. Oh, that's also weird. Also no, because it's gross. When you see people come, I don't know, it's different when you just go to a hotel, but you see people when you're cleaning the rooms, or you're stripping sheets and stuff. You're no, I'm not going to come sleep in this room. But also, why would I do that? I have to help clean it later. My parents have to help clean it later. So that's weird. So yeah, those are the two main things that people always asked me when I was little.
I don't even like the idea of thinking about people staying in a hotel or motel room that I'm going to stay in.
Right. Have to block out when you go stay in.
If I stay somewhere, I'm because if I think about it, I'm just going to change my mind.
Right. Yeah. So when else. You're no, that's gross. Yeah. I want to stay in my own room where it's clean. Somebody just didn't just sleep in my bed.
Did you guys have reoccurring guests, or long, I guess guests that had extended stays?
We did. There was this one guy, especially that I can think of, who, well, like my parents also, where they lived in Lufkin, this town was always like kind of building like new strip malls and things like that. So there was always a lot of construction. So my parents always, it was great. It was like good for them too when they had like these long contracts with construction workers or things like that, because then they would develop relationships with these folks, and like, you know, that's where like they found like real connection happening with the people that would come in and out the doors. Like, you don't build connections with people who come in and overnight. Not to say that never happened, but like it's more rare. But there was this one doctor who like lived in Dallas, which was about 4 hours away from Lufkin, and he would come to Lufkin like almost every weekend, or like every 2 weekends or something. He worked at a hospital in Lufkin, and he had like a family, and he would make that drive like every weekend or every couple of weekends. He did that for years and years and years and years and years. And we all knew him. We all like knew, you know, he basically like saw me like grow up through high school, and he was just like this nice guy, nice doctor. And I remember like like last year, the year before, my parents were like, oh, you know, we haven't seen him in so long. Like, we're kind of worried. Like, we haven't seen him. Like, what if like, you know, something happened to him? And I actually don't know if they found out. Like, it was kind of sad because you were like, oh, how do we ever find out? Like, if this person, like, something happened to him, or maybe he doesn't have that job anymore, or things like that. Like, they would know. They knew about his wife. They knew about his family, and he knew about ours. Like, it was really interesting. And I mean, he did that for years, like at least 10 years. And it was because he was paid well, but you know, just such an interesting character because he did this. Who would do this? I mean, that's how I would always wonder. I was like, he might, like, he's a doctor. Like, he has a job in Dallas, but yeah, like he would all come down every, you know, so often and like stay in this like motel, and work this job and then drive back home to his family. He was Asian American. It just like says something to you about like the hard work that, you know, immigrants will put in to succeed. I'll just say that.
What is the strangest, funniest, or unique interaction you've ever had with a guest?
I can't think of anything like at the top of my head. Sorry. I wish I had a better answer for that. I feel like for me, there's not a ton of like, I'm sure if I like thought about this harder, I would come up with a better answer. Maybe I will.
You always felt comfortable with the guests. There was no weirdness.
No, I definitely didn't. No, I definitely didn't always feel comfortable with guests. It was a little nerve-wracking because like sometimes, you know, I just didn't love working at the front desk. It's like a young woman, you know, it's a young kid. I often would try to have like, you know, like a friend come over and hang out or something like if I was working. But like generally, I mean, I felt pretty safe. It's just, you just never, sometimes like people would ask, yeah, like sometimes every now and then somebody would be like, how old are you? And I'd be like, you know, I'm old enough to rent you this room. Like, you know, like stuff like that. And this was when I was definitely like old enough to be working at the desk. Like, but every now and then, like, or somebody, you know, would ask me, oh, where are you guys from? And it's like, those types of questions pre like 2016 kind of just was like, yeah, sure, let me tell them, like, we're from India, you know. After 2016, Trump gets elected, and you don't really want to answer questions like, oh, where are you from? Stuff like that. Like, yeah. So for sure that used to happen. And I remember I was in Texas the night that Trump got elected, actually, and I was flying back to New York the next day where I was living. And I was just like, I remember leaving my parents and being, you do not engage with anybody who's coming through here trying to start something. Like, if they have something to say to you, let them walk out. Don't say shit back. Like, don't engage. Just like take it. And it was such a nerve-wracking, you know, moment. Like, I like got up and left and went to New York where like I felt perfectly safe. Parents here in like East Texas were like, God knows who was driving through with, you know, how many guns in their backyard, in the back of their trunk. Like, again, thank God, like we never had, you know, an experience where like my parents were like actually in physical danger. But there was a lot of like people you just don't know their intentions, and like they would ask weird questions and like made you feel really vulnerable and uncomfortable in the moment.
Yeah, that's definitely scary.
It was. And at the same time too, I feel like at the moment you know, it's not something that I really thought about too much when I was like growing up because I was so used to it. Fortunately, because like I did work at the front desk a lot for my parents so they could have any semblance of like a normal social life. And if it had been something that really like paralyzed me with fear, then I don't know, what we would have done.
What's the most unexpected skill you picked up from growing up in a motel?
Customer service, which is hilarious because now I work in a position where like I write, educational content and support customer service operations, and specifically for business products, and it's a really good skill to have. How to not just like appease a customer, but also know when like the customer is really not right, and how to talk yourself out of a situation or like, mediate a situation where people's feelings are really heightened, and there was a lot of maturity that I think I grew a lot, and I became really mature because I learned how to do those things really young. Even if I wasn't in the position that I'm working in with my day job, like I've always benefited from knowing how to interact with a customer, knowing how to like talk to somebody. In high school, I worked at Victoria's Secret. And I killed it at that job. Like I had to sign people up for credit cards, and like my manager had like incentives for the person who signed up the most credit cards, and I killed it because I knew how to talk to customers. It worked out for me because I was kind of naturally inclined to like be a good like front of house person, but can't like not give credit to having grown up as a motel kid for really teaching me skills like that young.
When you're ready, tell us your secret about how you're getting all these people to get credit cards.
You know what? A part of it is that it's so scammy. I hate it. Now that I think about it, I'm like, God, it's just such a scam, because I would get people to sign up for the credit cards because like you could literally convince them that they could sign up for the credit card and they could pay it off that day and they could never look at that credit card again. But of course, you know what happens once you've signed up for the credit card. Now you have it. Now you're getting coupons. Now, like it's just, and people love a little discount. And so like, the American school education system does not teach you about how to build credit. So like, you just don't understand that signing up for credit card actually has bigger implications than this 16-year-old is telling you about. So yeah, I was a good salesperson, but like, I knew exactly the things to like sell people on and exactly the things to not talk about. And I had a charming way of doing it because I knew how to talk to customers, but like it was set up well to sell itself. I wasn't like a prodigy in this area. It was just good. It was just like a good way to scam people into signing up for a credit card. And also like I was a good front of house customer associate. So like I did a good job. Not something I'm super proud of, but it is what it is now.
Well, in the end, it is really up to the other person.
No, it is. Yeah. But it's pretty predatory. And it's not from my perspective. It's just like from a corporate side of things, super predatory. And I think about that now, like how like these women walking into the store, just, trying to afford like a friggin' $55 bra, which at the time was $200, felt like it. And, someone's like, oh, if you sign up for the credit card today, you get 20% off and you could pay it right off and you could never look at it again. That makes sense in theory, but like now this person's definitely going to use this credit card again. And now you've trapped them. And now they're going to just, and it's like, oh, and you get like $1,000 starting credit. And like, it's a scam.
It's like, how many bras are you going to get at Victoria's Secret?
I never understood why people fall for that. Like I still don't have a credit card. Like I just never understood.
His credit cards are so, it's just like swipe, swipe, swipe. Like you just don't understand the consequences. Like people are, we're just taught about credit. And I wasn't like that because my dad was he opened a credit card for me when I was 16, but I wasn't buying anywhere, like I wasn't buying
exactly
for more credit cards or like buying a bunch of stuff. He was like, you're going to have a credit card in your name at 16.
Exactly.
So when I was like 25, I had like an 800 credit score. That makes a lot of sense. But, he figured that out, not from the American education system.
It's kind of something your parents just have to tell you.
Literacy in America. Yeah. So like, it was super scammy.
My policy is if I don't have the money, I don't pay for it.
Yeah, it's a good policy to have.
The bare minimum, I think, yeah.
I'll say this. Like, I'll say that it's, if anyone's listening who like was just like completely surprised by the fact that like Indian American, there's this like large population of Gujarati people who run motels and like kids live in the motels, and this is like a thing. I would say if I could inspire some empathy for people, or I'm sorry, if I could inspire some empathy in people for like these motel families, that would be great, because I often found that like it was really hard seeing like my parents like working really hard and then having to absorb so much disrespect from people. And I would say this across the board, right? Like you just don't go into like any coffee shop and act like an asshole. Just don't. People are just doing the best they can. I mean, like I get it. Like sometimes like people are really rude behind the desk too. But like people are really just trying to do the best they can. And if you're gonna rent a motel room at a mom and pop place at any like random town in America, and you see a brown person behind that desk, just realize that like that person, this is probably their entire life. And like they are doing a lot more than renting you this room to just like make ends meet, send their kids to college, achieve the American dream. Just, like they're working really, really hard. So like before you complain about just literally anything, I don't know what it is, that there's like a missing washcloth in your room, or like the AC doesn't work, or like whatever. Just like maybe do it with a little bit of empathy, because it's not a glamorous job. Like it's really just not a glamorous job. And I would say that if like people could just treat people in customer service positions across the board with more respect and gratitude for doing these jobs, that would be great. But like particularly if I could encourage people to do that for these like motel families, that would be a huge win for me.
Yeah, people just need to chill the heck out.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, thank you so much for joining us.
This is really enlightening, and thank you. Thank you for sharing your story and also, just about your experiences.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Nice to be able to highlight some of this stuff, especially even as I wrote this story like in 2019. So it's really nice to like when someone reaches out particularly about this article, because it's just nice that it has had such a long shelf life. So, I'm here to be the poster child for motel kids if I can be, because there's a lot of us out there, and it's nice to give some representation.
Well, thank you.
So much. Yeah.
We'd like to thank Foram for being on the show and for offering us a glimpse into the world that most of us only see briefly.
So that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can follow us on social media, and you can find our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.